Ideas Have Consequences by Richard M. Weaver. Chapter 2. Distinction and Hierarchy. Block quote. For if all things had come into being in this automatic fashion, instead of being the outcome of the mind, they would all be uniform and without distinction. End quote. Saint Athanasius. The most portentous general event of our time is the steady obliteration of those distinctions which create society. Rational society is a mirror of the Logos, and this means that it has a formal structure which enables apprehension. The preservation of society is therefore directly linked with the recovery of true knowledge. For the success of our restoration, it cannot be too often said that society and mass are contradictory terms, and that those who seek to do things in the name of mass are the destroyers in our midst. If society is something which can be understood, it must have structure. If it has structure, it must have hierarchy. Against this metaphysical truth, the declamations of the Jacobins break in vain. Perhaps the most painful experience of modern consciousness is the felt loss of the center. Yet, this is the inevitable result of centuries of insistence that society yield its form. Anyone can observe that people today are eager to know who is really entitled to authority, that they are looking wistfully for the sources of genuine value. In some, they wish to know the truth, but they have been taught a perversion which makes their chance of obtaining it less every day. This perversion is that in a just society, there are no distinctions. Our course has reached a point at which the question of whether man wishes to live in society at all, or whether he wishes to live in a kind of animal relationship, must be raised in all seriousness. For if the proscription against every kind of distinction continues, there is no hope of integration, except on the level of instinct. After man evolves his metaphysical dream and becomes capable of rational sentiment, he recognizes two grounds of elevation, knowledge and virtue. If these are not one, which problem need not be decided here. The good man, the man with proved allegiance to correct sentiment, has been the natural trustee of authority. The man of knowledge has been necessary for such duties as require system and foresight. With these criteria, it has been possible to erect a structure which mirrors our respect for value, in proportion to their contributions to the spiritual ideal, which creation expresses. Men have found lodgment on the various levels, with the essential feeling that since this structure is the Logos, their stations were not arbitrary, but natural and right. This society, in which the human being has a sense of direction, literally, it might be said, he knows up from down, because he knows where the higher goods are to be looked for. It is possible for him to live on the plane of spirit and intelligence, because some points of reference are fixed. Obviously, this is not a social situation in which everyone is called Joe, that anonymous name so eloquent of modern man's feeling about people. If sentiment endures, there will be real names and even honorifics. For the good of all, prerogative will attach to higher functions, and this will mean hierarchy. But hierarchy requires a common assumption about ends, and that is why the competing ideologies of our age produce confusion. The history of our social disintegration began with the unfixing of relationships in the 14th century. But the effort to do away with society entirely did not become programmatic until the 19th, when it appeared as a culmination of the prevailing nature philosophy. Since both knowledge and virtue require the concept of transcendence, they are really obnoxious to those committed to material standards, and we have seen how insistent was the impulse to look to lower levels for guidance. Into social thinking, there now enters a statistical unit, the consumer, which has the power to destroy utterly that metaphysical structure supporting hierarchy. Let us remember that traditional society was organized around king and priest, soldier and poet, peasant and artisan. Now, distinctions of vocation fade out, and the new organization, if such may be termed, is to be around capacities to consume. Underlying the shift is the theory of Romanticism. If we attach more significance to feeling than to thinking, we shall soon, by a simple extension, attach more to wanting than to deserving. Even institutions of learning have yielded to the utilitarian standard, and former President James B. Conant of Harvard University declared in an address that the chief contribution of American universities had been the idea of equality of all useful labor. This is the grand solution of socialism, which is itself the materialistic offspring of bourgeois capitalism. It clarifies much to see that socialism is in origin a middle class and not a proletarian concept. The middle class owes to its social location an especial fondness for security and complacency, protected on either side by classes which must absorb shocks. It would forget the hazards of existence. The lower class, close to the reality of need, develops a manly fortitude and is sometimes touched with nobility in the face of its precariousness. The upper class bears responsibility and cannot avoid leading a life of drama because much is put into its hands. Lightnings of favor or of discontent flash in its direction, and he is at the top of the hierarchy. Whether it rests on true values or not, knows that he is playing for his head. In between lies the besotted middle class, grown enormous under the new orientation of Western man, loving comfort, risking little, terrified by the thought of change. Its aim is to establish a materialistic civilization which will banish threats to its complacency. It has conventions, not ideals. It is washed rather than clean. The plight of Europe today is the direct result of the bourgeois ascendancy and its corrupted worldview. Thus, the final degradation of the Baconian philosophy is that knowledge becomes power in the service of appetite. The state, ceasing to express man's inner qualifications, turns into a vast bureaucracy designed to promote economic activity. It is little wonder that traditional values, however much they may be eulogized on commemorative occasions, today must dodge about and find themselves nooks and crannies if they are to survive at all. Burke's remark that the state is not, quote, a partnership in things subservient only to gross animal existence, end quote, now seems as antiquated as his tribute to chivalry. Upholders of tradition habitually classify the forces menacing our institutions as, quote, subversive activity, end quote. The description is just. There is often, in the language of ordinary people, a logic which, for want of philosophy, they cannot interpret. And so is there here. For it can be shown that subversive activity has an exact application. Indeed, it would be difficult to find a more accurate phrase. The expression means plainly an inversion by which matter is placed over spirit or quantity placed over quality. Thus it describes perfectly what is usually employed to describe the various forms of collectivism which rest on the materialistic philosophy. The dullest member of a conservative legislative committee seeking the source of threats to institutions does not fail to see that those doctrines which exalt material interests over spiritual, to the confounding of rational distinctions among men, are positively incompatible with the society he is elected to represent. For expressing such views, he is likely to be condemned as ignorant or selfish, because normally he does not express them very well. Let us therefore find him a gifted spokesman. Here is Shakespeare on the subject of subversive activity. Block quote. "Oh, when degree is shaken, when the ladder to all high designs, then enterprise is sick. How could communities, degrees in schools and brotherhoods in cities, peaceful commerce from dividable shores, the primogenity and due of birth, the prerogative of age, crowns, scepters, laurels, but by degree stand in authentic place? Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores, and make a sop of this solid globe. Strength should be lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead. Force should be right, or rather right and wrong, between whose endless jar justice resides, should lose their names, and so should justice too. Then everything includes itself in power, power into will, will into appetite, and appetite an universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce an universal prey, and last eat up himself." End quote. And Milton, despite his fierce republicanism, seems to have agreed that, quote, "orders and degrees jar not with liberty, but well consist." End quote. Our legislature may find support, too, in the first book of Corinthians, in which Paul defends, quote, "the versities of operations," end quote. Paul offers the metaphysical argument, block quote, "but now hath God set the members, every one of them in the body, as it hath pleased him. And if they were all one member, where were the body?" End quote. The program of social democracy would take away this, quote, "ladder to all high designs," end quote. It would do so because high design is an extremely unsettling conception. It may involve arduous effort, self-denial, sleepless nights, all of which are repugnant to the bourgeoisie. Footnote 1. I have here characterized the materialism underlying the mainstream of socialist thinking, but it is only fair to add that there are differing conceptions. There is, for example, the socialist poverty of the French poet Charles Péguy and the German general von Blomberg. In a conversation with Hermann Rauschening, I could identify socialism with Prussian discipline. Prussianism was always socialism, he said, because Prussianism means poverty and discipline. Prussianism means being hard to oneself and to others, but chiefly to oneself. Prussianism means happiness in work and satisfaction in service. Prussianism means living and dying in harness. This quote is from Men of Chaos, copyright 1942, Hermann Rauschening, courtesy of G.P. Putnam's Sons. Back to the main text. On the other hand, the goal of social democracy is scientific feeding. If one dares to visualize the millennium of the social democrats, he is forced to picture a, quote, healthy-minded, unquote, naturally good men, provided for by the paternalistic state, and seeking to save himself from extinction by boredom through dabbling in some art. Is it any wonder that social democracy has never been able to motivate its programs? De Tocqueville was too shrewd to miss the connection. Quote, "Comfort becomes a goal when distinctions of rank are abolished and privileges destroyed." End quote. Since subversive activity is the taking away of degree, it is logical that conservatives should treat as enemies all those who wish to abolish the sacred and secular grounds for distinctions among men. The proposals of the subverters is, however, impossible in practice, and the quarrel turns out to be over principles of selection. History thus far indicates that when the reformers get their turn, they merely substitute a bureaucratic hierarchy, and this because they discover that they do not wish society to collapse at all, but to continue under their conception of man's good. The fight is being waged on all fronts, and the most insidious idea employed to break down society is an undefined equalitarianism. That this concept does not make sense, even in the most elementary applications, has proved no deterrent to its spread, and we shall have something to say later on about modern man's growing incapacity for logic. An American political writer of the last century, confronted with the statement that all men are created free and equal, asked whether it would not be more accurate to say that no man was ever created free, and no two men ever created equal. Such hard-headedness would today be mistaken for frivolity. Thomas Jefferson, after his long apostleship to radicalism, made it the labor of his old age to create an educational system which would be a means of sorting out according to gifts and attainments. Such equalitarianism is harmful because it always presents itself as a redress of injustice, whereas in truth, it is the very opposite. I would mention here the fact, obvious to any candid observer, that equality is found most often in the mouths of those engaged in artful self-promotion. These secretly cherish the latter to high design, but find that they can mount the lower rungs more easily by making use of the catchword. We do not necessarily grudge them in their rise, but the concept they foster is fatal to the harmony of the world. The comity of peoples in groups, large or small, rests not upon this chimerical notion of equality, but upon fraternity, a concept which long antedates it in history, because it goes immeasurably deeper in human sentiment. The ancient feeling of brotherhood carries obligations of which equality knows nothing. It calls for respect and protection, for brotherhood is status and family by nature is hierarchical. It demands patience with little brother, and it may sternly exact duty of big brother. It places people in a network of sentiment, not of rights, that hortos sikos of modern vainglory. It is eloquent of that loss of respect for logic to which we owe so many disasters of the French Revolution, made equality and fraternity coordinates. In so doing, it offered a foretaste of the contemporary political campaign, which shamelessly promises everything. Equality is a disorganizing concept, insofar as human relationships mean order. It is order without a design. It attempts a meaningless and profitless regimentation of what has been ordered from time immemorial by the scheme of things. No society can rightly offer less than equality before the law, but there can be no equality of condition between youth and age or between the sexes. There cannot be equality even between friends. The rule is that each shall act where he is strong. The assignment of identical roles produces, first, confusion, and then alienation. As we have increasing opportunity to observe. Not only is this disorganizing heresy busily confounding the most natural social groupings, it is also creating a reservoir of poisonous envy. How much of the frustration of the modern world proceeds from starting with the assumption that all are equal, finding that this cannot be so, and then having to realize that one can no longer fall back on the bond of fraternity. However paradoxical it may seem, fraternity has existed in the most hierarchical organizations. It exists, as we have just noted, in that archetype of hierarchy, the family. The essence of cooperation is congeniality. The feeling of having been, quote, born together, end quote. Fraternity directs attention to others, equality to self, and the passion for equality is simultaneously with the growth of egotism. The frame of duty which fraternity erects is itself the source of ideal conduct. Where men feel that society means station, the highest and the lowest see their endeavors contributing to a common end, and they are in harmony rather than in competition. It will be found as the general rule that those parts of the world which have talked least of equality have in solid fact of their social life exhibited the greatest fraternity. Such was true of feudal Europe, before people succumbed to various forms of the proposal that every man should be king. Nothing is more manifest than that at this social distance has diminished, and all groups have moved nearer equality. Suspicion and hostility have increased. In the present world, there is little of trust and less of loyalty. People do not know what to expect of one another. Leaders will not lead, and servants will not serve. It is a matter of common observation, too, that people meet most easily when they know their position. If their work and authority are defined, they can proceed on fixed assumptions and conduct themselves without embarrassment toward inferior and superior. When the rule of equality obtains, however, no one knows where he belongs, because he has been assured that he is, quote, just as good as anybody else, end quote. He is likely to suspect that he is getting less than his deserts. Shakespeare concluded his wonderful discourse on degree with reference to, quote, an envious fever, end quote. And when Mark Twain, in the role of Connecticut Yankee, undertook to destroy the hierarchy of Camelot, he was furious to find that serfs and others of the lower order were not resentful of their condition. He adopted, then, the typical Jacobin procedure of instilling hatred of all superiority. Resentment, as Richard Hertz has made plain, may well prove the dynamite which will finally wreck Western society. The basis of an organic social order is fraternity, uniting parts that are distinct. We must repeat, then, with reference to our first principles, that rebellion against distinction is an aspect of the worldwide and centuries-long movement against knowledge, whose beginning goes back to nominalism, for it requires only a slight transference to say that if our classifications of the world of physical nature are arbitrary, so too are those of human society. In other words, after we grant that those generalizations about the world, which we necessarily make, and this is a necessity, no one can really deny, they do not express an objective order, but only afford convenient modes. The same must be granted about society. With this conceded, inherent pattern is gone. Nothing is justified that does not serve convenience. And there remains no court of appeal against subversion by pragmatism. Thus repudiation of knowledge of what is destroys the basis of renewal. It is not fantastic, but rather realistic, to see as an ultimate result of this process the end of civilization. It is generally assumed that the erasing of all distinctions will usher in the reign of pure democracy. But the inability of pure democracy to stand for something intelligible leaves it merely a verbal deception. If it promises equality before the law, it does no more than empires and monarchies have done, and cannot use this as a ground to assert superiority. If it promises equality of condition, it promises injustice, because one law for the ox and the lion is tyranny. Pressure from the consumer instinct usually compels it to promise the latter. When it was found that equality before the law has no effect on inequalities of ability and achievement, humanitarians concluded that they had been tricked into asking only part of their just claim. The claim to political equality was then supplemented by the demand for economic democracy, which was to give substance to the ideal of the levelers. Nothing but a despotism could enforce anything so unrealistic, and this explains why modern governments dedicated to this program have become, under one guise and another, despotic. There are other aspects to the dilemma of radical egalitarianism. A defense often employed by the more sophisticated is that democratic equality allows each to develop his potentialities. This plausible argument involves grave questions about the nature of things. It is here implied that man is like a seed, having some imminent design of germination, so that for his flowering he needs that liberty which is, quote, freedom from, end quote. If this is the whole account, it can only mean that our determination is naturalistic, and that our growth is merely the unfolding of a plan established purely by nature. One need hardly add that this conception adds orientation from below and assumes that man's destiny is to be natural, to develop like a plant. This makes impossible any thought of discipline, which would, under these circumstances, be a force constraining what nature had intended. But all teleology rejects, quote, freedom from, end quote, in favor of, quote, freedom to, end quote. That men are a field of wildflowers, naturally good in their growing, is the romantic fallacy. A kindred notion is that democracy means opportunity for advancement, or in the language of the day, quote, a chance to be a success, end quote. Obviously, this contention presumes hierarchy. The sort of advancement contemplated by these advocates is just the kind that requires a condition of high social organization, with rewards, degrees, and everything that comes with a frank recognition of superiority. If democracy means a chance to get ahead, it means a chance to rise above the less worthy, to have a station with reference to points above and below. The solution of the dilemma is that these people wish democracy not as an end, but as a means. Confronted with realities described, the Democrat may confess that his democracy is only a correction for a distorted aristocracy. He does want order, but he wants the kind in which the best, the gifted, and the industrious get ahead. There must be a fence, but the wrong rail is on top. Notwithstanding this claim that democracy is quicker to recognize native worth, every visitor to a democratic society has been struck by its jealous demand for conformity. Such spirit is an outgrowth of competition and suspicion. The Democrats well sense that if they allow people to divide according to abilities and preferences, soon structure will impose itself upon the mass. Hence the adulation of the regular fellow, the political seduction of the common man, and the deep distrust of intellectuals, whose grasp of principle gives them superior insight. This society may even pay tribute to the exemplar of easy morals, for he is the, quote, good fellow, end quote, who has about him none of the uncomfortable angularities of the idealist. It seems plain that the Democrats are ignoring a contradiction. Had they courage to be logical, they would do as their predecessors in ancient Greece, and chose their governors by lot. An election is, after all, a highly undemocratic proceeding. The very term means discrimination. How is it possible to choose the best man when by definition there is no best? If a society wishes to be its natural self, that is to say, if it wishes to flourish wild, unshaped by anything superior to itself, it should make a perfectly random choice of administrators. Let youth and age, wisdom and folly, courage and cowardice, self-control and dissoluteness sit together on the bench. This will be representative. This is a cross-section, and there seems no room to question that it would create that society, quote, filled with wonderful variety and disorder, end quote, which Plato called democracy. A footnote, however, must be added to the practice of the Greeks. There were certain officials of highest importance, whom they saw fit to choose by election. These were, as might be guessed, the strategoi, the military commanders. It was seen that since the very existence of the state depends on them, and since a general must have skill, it is better here to take note of differences and admit that in time of emergency, authority goes to knowledge. Democratic leadership thus always runs into an anomaly. It has been argued that whatever the aberrations of the democratic state in periods of crisis such as civil war and the threat of invasion, the people instinctively choose a leader of the more than average nature who will guide them through. Even if this could be proved historically, which is doubtful, it would damage the theoretical foundation of democracy. For it affirms that in the time of crisis, the people, whether instinctively or otherwise, defer to an elite group who know what to do. When they realize that only direction will save them, they accept it, and care not who rails against dictatorship. And when high design becomes imperative, they delegate authority to the extent of placing it beyond their control. Footnote 2. Norman Thomas has put this in the form of a dilemma by asking whether Roosevelt was justified in taking the American people into the Second World War, against their will and knowledge. If he was, then the leader is something apart from the masses, not merely the executor of their wishes. And thus we have again the ancient dichotomy of ruler and ruled. We now return to the main text. In the periods between, they are inclined to indulge in the comfort of relaxation and disorder, which is itself a commentary on ideals. Of course, this question is inseparable from that end of the state, as that is, in turn, from the end of the individual being. The writings of the founding fathers of the American Union indicate that these political architects approached democracy with a spirit of reservation. Though revolutionaries by historic circumstance, they were capable enough of philosophy to see these dilemmas. The Federalist authors especially were aware that the simple majority cannot suffice, because it does everything without reference. It is an expression of feeling about the moment at the moment, restrained neither by abstract idea nor by precedent. They therefore labored long and with considerable cunning to perfect an instrument which should transcend even the law-making body. This was the Constitution, which in the American system stands for political truth. It is not an unchangeable truth, but the framers placed special obstacles in the way of change. It was hoped that the surmounting of these would prove so laborious and slow that errors would be exposed and the permanently true recognized. In this way, they endeavored to protect the populace of a republic against itself. Their action is a rebuke to the romantic theory of human nature. And this will explain why the Constitution has proved so galling to Jacobins. They regard it as a kind of mortmain, and during the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, its interpreters were scornfully termed, in an expression indicative of the modern temper, quote, 9 old men, end quote. Edmund Burke was forced to meet the same problem when the French Revolution drove him to examine the foundations of British constitutional liberty. In the absence of a written constitution, he had the difficult task of establishing the fact that the English people are bound by a transcending limitation. The long passages of the Reflections on Succession of the Crown has, I think, been misinterpreted. For Burke does not mean, as Thomas Paine asserted, that a single British Parliament made itself a political atom, by whose enactment all succeeding generations were bound. He rather argues that this act was a precedent in conformity with other precedents, the sum of which binds the English people. If we are to be guided by the experience of the past, there is a perfectly real sense in which the precedent is non-repealable, and precedent was for Burke the principle of continuity in reference. The inheritance of, quote, rational liberty, end quote, was thus Britain's protection against subversion. It has been said countless times in this country that democracy cannot exist without education. The truth concealed in this observation is that only education can be depended on to bring men to see the hierarchy of values. That is another way of saying what has also been affirmed before, that democracy cannot exist without aristocracy. The aristocracy is a leadership which, if it is to endure, must be constantly recruited from democracy. Hence, it is equally true that aristocracy cannot exist without democracy. But what we have failed to provide against is the corruption of the system of recruitment by equalitarian dogma and the allurements of materialism. There is no difficulty in securing enough agreement for action on the point that education should serve the needs of the people, but all hinges on the interpretation of needs. If the primary need of man is to perfect his spiritual being and prepare for immortality, then education of the mind and the passions will take precedence over all else. The growth of materialism, however, has made this a consideration remote and even incomprehensible to the majority. Those who maintain that education should prepare one for living successfully in the world have won a practically complete victory. Now, if it were possible to arrive at a sufficiently philosophical conception of success, there would still remain room for idealistic goals, and attempts have been made to do something like it by defining in philosophical language what constitutes a free man. Yet the prevailing conception is that education must be such as will enable one to acquire enough wealth to live on the plane of the bourgeoisie. That kind of education does not develop the aristocratic virtues. It neither encourages reflection nor inspires a reverence for the good. In other words, it is precisely because we have lost our grasp of the nature of knowledge that we have nothing to educate with for the salvation of our order. America certainly cannot be reproached for failing to invest adequately in the hope that education would prove a redemption. They have built numberless high schools, lavish in equipment, only to see them under the prevailing scheme of values turned into social centers and institutions for improving the personality, where teachers, living in fear of constituents, dare not enforce scholarship. They have built colleges on an equal scale, only to see them turned into playgrounds for grown-up children, or centers of vocationalism and professionalism. Finally, they have seen pragmatists as if in peculiar spite against the very idea of hierarchy, endeavoring to turn class into democratic forums, where the teacher is only a moderator, and no one offends by presuming to speak with superior knowledge. The formula of popular education has failed democracy, because democracy has rebelled at the thought of sacrifice, the sacrifice of time and material goods, without which there is no training in intellectual discipline. The spoiled child psychology, of which I shall say something later, has sought a royal road to learning. In this way, when even its institutions of learning serve primarily the ends of gross animal existence, its last recourse to order is destroyed by appetite. Every attempt to find a way out of these dilemmas points to a single necessity. Some source of authority must be found. The only source of authority whose title is unimpeachable at all times is knowledge. But superiority in knowledge carries prerogative, which implies, of course, distinction and hierarchy. We have seen, too, that the possibility of liberty and the hope of personal improvement rest upon these, for liberty must always work in the name of right reason, which is itself a conception of the scheme of things. The conservatives of our day have a case which only their want of imagination keeps them from making use of, in the proposition that levelers are foes of freedom. Where simple massness exists, everyone is in everyone else's way, and a certain perilous liberty has been traded for stultification. The average man of the present age has a metaphysic in the form of a conception known as, quote, progress, end quote. It is certainly to his credit that he does not wish to be a sentimentalist in his endeavors. He wants some measure for purposeful activity. He wants to feel that through the world some increasing purpose runs, and nothing is more common than to hear him discriminate people according to his metaphysic. His term for the less worthy being, quote, unprogressive, end quote. But since the metaphysic calls only for magnitude and number, since it is becoming without a goal, it is not a source of distinctions in value. It is a system of quantitative comparison. Its effect, therefore, has been to collapse the traditional hierarchy and to produce economic man, whose destiny is mere activity. The mere notion of infinite progress is destructive. If the goal recedes forever, one point is no nearer it than the last. All that we can do is compare meaninglessly yesterday, tomorrow, and today. Aristotle noted that the concept of infinity makes impossible the idea of good. If a series of things is hierarchically ordered, it is conditioned from top to bottom, and so cannot be infinite. If it is infinite, it cannot be conditioned from top to bottom, and there is no higher and lower. Now such a look at the nature of things is imperative, for our conception of a metaphysical reality finally governs our conception of everything else. And if we feel that creation does not express purpose, it is impossible to find an authorization for purpose in our lives. Indeed, the assertion of purpose in a world we felt to be purposeless would be a form of sentimentality. Chapter 3. Fragmentation and Obsession. Block quote. All ideas are in God, and insofar as they have reference to God, they are true and adequate, and therefore none are inadequate or confused, save insofar as they have reference to the individual mind of anyone. End quote. Spinoza. Whoever argues for a restoration of values is sooner or later met with the objection that one cannot return, or, as the phrase is likely to be, quote, "You can't turn the clock back," end quote. By thus assuming that we are prisoner of the moment, the objection well reveals the philosophic position of modernism. The believer in truth, on the other hand, is bound to maintain that the things of highest value are not affected by the passage of time. Otherwise, the very concept of truth becomes impossible. In declaring that we wish to recover lost ideals and values, we are looking toward an ontological realm which is timeless. Only the sheerest relativism insists that passing time renders unattainable one ideal while forcing upon us another. Therefore, those that say we can have the integration we wish, and those who say we cannot, differ in their ideas of ultimate reality. For the latter are positing the primacy of time and of matter. And this is the kind of division which prevents us from having one world. Now the return, which the idealists propose, is not a voyage backward through time, but a return to center, which must be conceived metaphysically or theologically. They are seeking the one which endures, and not the many which change and pass. And this search can be only described as looking for the truth. They are making the ancient affirmation that there is a center of things, and they point out that every feature of modern disintegration is a flight from this toward periphery. It is expressible also as a movement from unity to individualism. In proportion as man approaches the outer rim, he becomes lost in details. And the more he is preoccupied with details, the less he can understand them. A recovery of certain viewpoints associated with the past would be a recovery of understanding as such. And this, unless we admit ourselves to be helpless in the movement of a deterministic march, is possible at any time. In brief, one does not require a particular standpoint to comprehend the timeless. Let us remember, all the while, that the very notion of eternal verities is repugnant to the modern temper. It will be useful to review here this flight toward periphery, or the centrifugal force of our culture. In the Middle Ages, when there obtained a comparatively clear perception of reality, a possessor of highest learning was the philosophic doctor. He stood at the center of things because he had mastered principles. On a level far lower were those who had acquired only facts and skills. It was the abandonment of metaphysics and theology which undermined the position of the philosophic doctor, a position remarkably like that prescribed by Plato for the philosopher king. For the philosophic doctor was in charge of the general synthesis. The assertion that philosophy is queen of studies meant more to him than a figure of speech. Knowledge of ultimate matters conferred a right to decide ultimate questions. This is why, for example, the faculty of theology at the Sorbonne could be appealed to on matters of financial operation, which, in our era of fragmentation, would be regarded as exclusively the province of the banker. In the course of the evolution that we have traced, the philosophic doctor was displaced, but a substitute had to be found, for synthesis requires the reconciling of all interests. To take over his task, the dawning modernism chose the gentleman. There was logic in this choice, for the gentleman is a secularized expression of the same thing. Rulers any group must have. And, after repudiating the sanction of religion, the age turned to the product of a training which would approximate religion in breadth and depth. Consequently, there appears at this point a great interest in humanities and liberal arts. In Aristotle's program for the young ruler, Montaigne, Rabelais, Castiglione, Sir Thomas More, Thomas Eliot, and others offered regimens to train men who should be broad enough to deal with the interests of society. Milton's ideal of the educated man who was ready to perform, quote, all duties, both public and private, of peace and war, end quote, expressed the same thought. The most important thing about the gentleman was that he was an idealist, though his idealism lacked the deepest foundations. He was bred up to a code of self-restraint which taught resistance to pragmatic temptation. He was definitely a man of sentiment who refused to put matters on a basis of materialism and self-aggrandizement. One can say this in the convention that the gentleman was a man of his word and the ritual that he observed toward fallen foes and the weaker. His acceptance of the rules of courtesy militated against egotism. In one thing, he was deficient. He had lost sight of the spiritual origin of self-discipline. This loss, of course, had grave consequences. Yet, it cannot be denied that the gentleman can at least partially fill the role of philosophic doctor. He will serve as exemplar to the humanist secularized society, as the other did to a religious. As long as the Western world could maintain a gentleman class, whether by some principle of inheritance or by recruitment from generation to generation, it retained a measure of protection, for it had here a group not wholly absorbed or obsessed, who held a general view of the relationship of things, though it was somewhat weakened by the difficulty of defining grounds for its authority, the problem of how any man, qua man, is better than any other. Still, its presence meant balance, and people had some comfort in the thought that policy was being made by men of, quote, broad views, end quote. For such are the inculcations of liberal education. Gentlemen did not always live up to their ideal, but the existence of an ideal is a matter of supreme importance. In attenuated form, the ideal survives until today, though the forces of modernism conspire to extinguish it. In the countries of Europe, one after another, the gentleman has been ousted by politicians and entrepreneurs. As materialism has given its rewards to the sort of cunning incompatible with any kind of idealism. In the United States, the new and the old Europe came into conflict in 1861. The American South not only had cherished the ideal, but had given it an infusion of fresh strength, partly through its social organization, but largely through its education in rhetoric and law. The South's tradition of learning was the Ciceronian tradition of eloquent wisdom. And this circumstance explains why the major creative political figures of America, from Jefferson through Lincoln to Wilson, have come from this section. But the Civil War brought defeat to the Ciceronian humanism, and therefore the South turned to commerce and technology in its economic life, and to the dialectic of New England and of Germany in its educational endeavors. The gentleman was left to walk the stage, an impecunious eccentric, protected by a certain sentimentality, but no longer understood. Europe, after the agony of the First World War, turned to the opposite type for leadership, to gangsters, who, though they are often good entrepreneurs, are without code and without inhibitions. Footnote 1. George Santayana, interviewed in Rome after its capture by American troops, declared that Mussolini had done as much for the city as the two Napoleons had done for Paris, but that he, quote, definitely was not a gentleman, End quote. We now return to the main text. Such leaders in Europe have given us a preview of what the collapse of values and the reign of specialization will produce. By far, the most significant phase of the theory of the gentleman is its distrust of specialization. It is an ancient belief, going back to the classical antiquity, that specialization of any kind is illiberal in a free man. A man willing to bury himself in the details of some small endeavor has been considered lost to these larger considerations, which must occupy the mind of the ruler. The attitude is well expressed in King Philip's famous taunt to his son Alexander, who had learned to perform skillfully upon the flute. Quote, "Are you not ashamed, son, to play so well?" End quote. It is contained in the hierarchy of knowledge in Aristotle's Metaphysics. It is explained by Plutarch with the observation that, quote, "He who busies himself with mean occupations produces in the very pains he takes about things of little use evidence against himself of his negligence and indisposition to what is really good." End quote. The attitude is encountered in men of letters of the 17th and 18th centuries. They wished to be known as gentlemen first, and writers only incidentally. Finally, there is the story of the barber who congratulated Napoleon for not having a scholar's knowledge of the proper pronunciation of Alexandria. To regard these as exhibitions of priggishness is to miss the point entirely. They are expressions of contempt for the degradation of specialization and pedantry. Specialization develops only part of a man. A man partially developed is deformed, and one deformed is the last person to be thought of as a ruler. So runs the irresistible logic of the position. Science is therefore not a pursuit for such a one, because it demands an ever more minute inspection of the physical world. It makes an ideal of specialism, and one may recall Nietzsche's figure of the scientist who spends his life studying the brain structure of the leech. Is it necessary to press further the point that when such matters come to be pursued as knowledge, the task of synthesis approaches impossibility? The position of the philosophic doctor and of his secular heir, the gentleman, was thus correct. For them, the highest knowledge concerned, respectively, the relation of men to God and the relation of men to men. They did not expect to learn what they most needed to know by fleeing center, that is, by diving ever deeper into the mysteries of the physical world. Such is escape and moral defeatism. When Socrates declared in the Phaedrus that he learned not from the trees of the country, but from the men of the city, he was exposing the fallacy of scientism. At this point, the student ceases to be a doctor of philosophy, since he is no longer capable of philosophy. He has made himself an essentially ridiculous figure, and this would have been perceived had not the public, undergoing the same process of debasement, found a different ground on which to venerate him. Knowledge was power. The very character of the new researches lent them to ad hoc purposes. It was soon a banality that the scholar contributes to civilization by adding to its dominion over nature. It is just as if Plato's philosopher had left the city to look at the trees, and then had abandoned speculative wisdom for dendrology. The people who would urge just this course are legion among us today. The facts on the periphery, they feel, are somehow more certain. The modern knower may be compared to an inebriate who, as he senses his loss of balance, endeavors to save himself by fixing tenaciously upon certain details, and thus affords the familiar exhibition of positiveness and arbitrariness. With the world around him beginning to heave, he grasps at something that will come within a limited perception. So the scientist, having lost hold upon organic reality, clings the more firmly to his discovered facts, hoping that salvation lies in what can be objectively verified. From this comes a most important symptom of our condition, the astonishing vogue of factual information. It is naturally impossible for anyone to get along without some knowledge that he feels can be relied on. Having been told by the relativists that he cannot have truth, he now has, quote, facts, end quote. One notes that even in everyday speech the word fact has taken the place of truth. Quote, it is a fact, end quote, is now the formula for categorical assertion. Where fact is made the criterion, knowledge has been rendered unattainable. And the public is being taught systematically to make this fatal confusion of factual particulars with wisdom. On the radio and in magazines and newspapers appear countless games and quizzes designed to test one's stock of facts. The acquisition of unrelated details becomes an end in itself and takes the place of the true ideal of education. So, misleading is the program that one widely circulated column invites readers to test their, quote, horse sense, end quote, by answering the factual queries it propounds. The same attention to peripheral matter long ago invaded schools at the topmost levels, it must be confessed, where it is made nonsense of literary study and almost ruined history. The supposition that facts will speak for themselves is, of course, another abdication of intellect. Like impressionist artists, the objectivists prostrate themselves before exterior reality on the assumption that the organizing work of the mind is deceptive. Plato reminded us that at any stage of an inquiry, it is important to realize whether we are moving toward or away from first principles. The significance of the movement we are here tracing is that the former distrust of specialization has been supplanted by its opposite, a distrust of generalization. Not only has man become a specialist in practice, he is being taught that special facts represent the highest form of knowledge. Mathematical logic, with its attempt to evade universal classification, is an excellent example of the tendency. The extreme of nominalism appears when men fear, as many do today, to make even those general groupings which are requisite to ordinary activities. We are developing a phobia towards simple predication, sensing that even expository statement is a form of argument, and that argument implies the existence of truth. We shrink back by clinging to our affirmation of particulars. They seem innocuous. Any extension beyond, toward center, may involve grave duties. Since liberalism became a kind of official party line, we have been enjoined against saying things about races, religions, or national groups. For, after all, there is no categorical statement without its implication of value, and values begin divisions among men. We must not define subsume, or judge, we must rather rest upon the periphery and display, quote, sensibility toward the cultural expression of all lands and people, end quote. This is a process of emasculation. It should be plain from the foregoing that modern man is suffering from a severe fragmentation of his world picture. This fragmentation leads directly to an obsession with isolated parts. Obsession, according to the canons of psychology, occurs when an innocuous idea is substituted for a painful one. The victim simply avoids recognizing the thing which will hurt. We have seen that the most painful confession for the modern egotist to make is that there is a center of responsibility. He has escaped it by taking his direction with reference to the smallest points. The theory of empiricism is plausible because it assumes that accuracy about small matters prepares the way for valid judgment about large ones. What happens, however, is that the judgments are never made. The pedantic empiricist, buried in his little province of phenomena, imagines that fidelity to it exempts him from concern with larger aspects of reality. In the case of science, from consideration of where there is reality other than matter. Such obsession with fragments has grave consequences for the individual psychology, not the least of which is fanaticism. Now, fanaticism has been properly described as redoubling one's effort after one's aim has been forgotten. And this definition will serve as a good introduction to the fallacy of technology, which is the conclusion that because a thing can be done, it must be done. The means absorb completely, and man becomes blind to the very concept of ends. Indeed, even among those who make an effort at reflection, an idea grows that ends must wait upon the discovery of means. Hence proceeds a fanatical interest in the properties of matter, which is psychopathic, because it involves escape, substitution, and the undercurrent of anxiety, which comes of knowing that the real issue has not been met. If, then, the substitution of means for ends is the essence of fanaticism, we can better recognize the peril in which science and technology have placed our souls. Sanity is a proportion with reference to purpose. There is no standard of sanity when the whole question of ends is omitted. The obsession, however, is a source of great comfort to the obsessed. It is a reprieve from the real ordeal. Let us not question the genuineness of the sigh of relief when people are allowed to go back to their test tubes and their facts. A high degree of instability is another aspect of this psychopathology. It is not to be anticipated that rational self-control will flourish in the presence of fixation upon parts. Workers confined to very small tasks have been found to show a special tendency toward emotional instability, and one sees everywhere, in urban populations, a volatility of temperament that contrasts with the steadiness of the man living close to nature. It shows itself in fits of fickle admiration, in excitation over slight causes, in hypersuggestibility and proneness to panic, all of which render most unlikely that sober estimate of men and things characterizing the philosopher. An observer coming into some modern metropolis from a province where traditional values are yet rooted is impressed by the way in which judgments are made without reference. He encounters arguments which are brilliant, perhaps within a narrow scope, but which, when pushed a step in the direction of first principles, collapse for want of basic relevance. He finds movements propagated with all the cleverness of sophisticated techniques, which appear absurd as soon as their presuppositions about human nature and human destiny are laid bare. The fragmentarian character of such thinking permits contradictions and sudden reversals, and these prevent emotional composure in the face of choice. We have now observed some of the results from the evolution from philosophic doctor to gentleman to specialist. At this point, we find that the specialist is inferior psychically to his predecessors. He is like some parvenu, striving to cover up with self-assertion the guilty feeling that he is not qualified. For the truth is that fanaticism and emotional instability, tension and flightiness are compared with that seasoned maturity which we expect in a leader. A man who understands has reason to be sure of himself. He has the repose of mastery. He is the sane man who carries his center gravity in himself. He has not succumbed to obsession which binds him to a fragment of reality. People tend to trust the judgments of an integrated personality, and will prefer them to the official opinions of experts. They rightly suspect that expertise conceals some abnormality of viewpoint. Thus, the specialist stands ever at the borderline of psychosis. It has been remarked that when one passes among the patients of a psychopathic ward, he encounters, among the several sufferers, every aspect of normal personality in morbid exaggeration, so that it would be possible theoretically to put together a super mind by borrowing something from each. And as one passes through modern centers of enterprise and of higher learning, he is met with similar autonomies of development. Each would be admired for his little achievement of power and virtuosity. Each is resentful of subordination, because for him, a specialty has become the world. The public, retaining a certain perspective by virtue of its naive realism, calls them, quote, lopsided, end quote. There is no reason to quarrel with the metaphor. The scientist, the technician, the scholar, who have left the one for the many, are puffed up with vanity over their ability to describe precisely some minute portion of the world. Men so obsessed with fragments can be no more reasoned with than other psychotics, and hence the observation of Ortega y Gasset that the mere task of saving our civilization demands, quote, incalculably subtle powers, end quote. Civilization must be saved from some who profess to be its chief lights and glories. Thoughtful people today are sometimes moved to wonder why the world no longer has a use for a liberally educated class. Surely the answer lies in this abandonment of generalization for specialization, which is the very process of fragmentation. The world has willfully narrowed responsibilities. Now the question of whether it is possible for everyone to be a philosopher, if we are willing to go back to essentials, is a part of the larger question of whether everyone can participate in the aristocratic virtues. This is the problem of wisdom and self-control. And there have existed societies in which a far larger proportion of the people had access to general responsibility, which acted as a counterpoise to the psychopathic tendencies. Let us look, for example, at pre-industrial America. The feature of that society, which contrasts most strongly with our own, was the distribution of centers of influence and authority. We might take, as a single instance, a Vermont farmer of the 1850s, certainly not one to give himself airs, yet a vessel of some responsibility, and, to that extent, an aristocrat by calling. He has not been properly admired for his independence, by which is meant not isolation from community life, On the contrary, he appears to have been active in town meeting and at the poll, but opportunity and disposition to decide for himself, according to a rational and enduring code of values. His acres may have been rocky, but he appraised his situation and assumed direction. He rose early because the relationship between effort and reward was clear to him. There was a rhythm to his task which humanized it, each day bringing a certain round of duties, and the reasons themselves imposing a larger pattern, as when haying time arrived. At the end of the day, he might remain up until 9 o'clock with the weekly newspaper, not flipping through the comics and sporting news, but reading its political disquisitions, to weigh and consider as carefully as Bacon could have desired. He observed the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, with some recollections of what they signified. He remained poor, but he was not unmanned. He had enough character to say no. With the advance of industrialism, this type of individual is exploited, and then, because he is exploited, contemned. Native dignity becomes an old fashion, and character is often an obstruction to the wheels of economic progress. Indeed, the sort of social hierarchy we have described as reflecting knowledge of value is abolished, and there is substituted a structure containing a mass of workers below and a small group of elite who are themselves technicians at the top. The workers are likely not to know what they are producing, and the managers are likely not to care. Division of labor may become so minute that it is impossible for the individual to grasp the ethical implications of his task, even if he were disposed to try. And when we harness this industrial organization to modern political bureaucracy, we get a monster of a frightful aspect. Under such arrangement, the state not only unmans its citizens, but makes criminals of them in addition. There could be no better example of this than the atomic bomb project of the United States in the Second World War. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a force of 70,000 persons labored at an undertaking whose nature they knew little or nothing about. In fact, wartime propaganda had been so effective that they took pride in their ignorance and boasted of it as a badge of honor or as a sign of cooperation. In what? It is just possible that a few, and I, should be willing to say a very few, had they known that their efforts were being directed to the slaughter of non-combatants on a scale never before contemplated, or to a perfection of brutality, as we have defined the term, might have refused complicity. Perhaps they would have had some concept of war as an institution which forbids aimless killing. Perhaps they would have had a secret feeling that this world is morally designed and that offenses of this kind, under whatever auspices committed, bring retribution. In any case, it is just possible that a few of these anonymous toilers would have given a thought to the larger responsibility. It is rumored that among the world's elite concerned with atomic research, there were a few who declined to participate in an operation so contrary to the canons of civilization. Their names have remained unsung. It is to their credit that they rose above specialization, but to do this they had to contemplate ends. The laborers in the vast enterprise were in no such position, but few tears have been shed for them. Imagine the modern state considering a referendum to conscience. The bomb was an unparalleled means. Was this not enough? Just so does modern industrial and political organization, which is a rational hierarchy, make the citizen an ethical eunuch. If Thoreau felt, in his time, that it was a disgrace to even be associated with the government, what would he have felt in this? These corrupt bureaucracies are contemptuous of the people, in whose name they so piously speak. Thus, atomic energy, the final discovery of Prometheus, should compel all to see the imperative nature of the question of who shall control. It is, of course, a question that should have been asked long ago about the potential represented by machinery. And our conception of the problem seems to yet be in an extremely elementary stage, for we are arguing whether one nation or a group of nations or a federation of all nations should be a custodian. Eventually, the question of who within the group, national or international, can be trusted with such means will have to be faced. The conclusion, so vexatious to democracy, that wisdom and not popularity qualifies for rule, may be forced upon us by the peril in atomic energy. Wisdom does not lie on the periphery. Granting that the bomb project was an extreme case, though it may be the typical case of the future, we can discern elsewhere the steady trend towards fragmentation and irresponsibility. As a system of production becomes, quote, functionally rationalized, end quote, the worker is made to surrender both freedom and initiative. As long as the political order remains stable, he may maintain a robot-like existence. But when it breaks down and he is thrown back upon his own resources, it becomes apparent that these resources have been allowed to diminish. Unaccustomed to determining anything about the purpose and the relationships of his work, he cannot even think in terms large enough to embrace the total situation. The enforced irresponsibility has itself become a factor in pathology. For a burden of responsibility is, after all, the best means of getting anyone to think straight. If he is made to feel that he is accountable for results, he looks steadily at the situation and endeavors to discover what is really true in it. This is a discipline. But when he has long been absolved of the duty of thinking, he may be seized with a sense of helplessness and panic when the necessity of it is thrust upon him. In such circumstances, it is quite natural for him to turn to some member of the managerial elite, who in the industrial age of society is himself a specialist. By losing sight of what the good life demands, he has allowed himself to be maneuvered into a position in which he is not permitted to be a whole man. There is every indication that he retains the same capacity for loyalty, but what has he to be loyal to? The highly unstable character of our political world must be ascribed at least in part to repressions. If tidal waves of feeling move beneath the surface and find no outlet save in obsession, we cannot be surprised at monstrous perversions. The separation which the German was able to make between his fragment of technology and the political program into which he poured his feelings offers a clue to much. Visitors to Germany after the collapse of the Third Reich reported hearing scientists say, quote, "What have I to do with politics? I am a technician," end quote. It is impossible that such people should feel a sense of guilt. To give these, or any modern people, a sense of guilt, it would be necessary to go back and explain the sin of Prometheus. Similar pleas, no doubt, would have been made by the toilers at Oak Ridge, had the decision gone against their side. The fact that, as the war went on, the Germans put more and more faith in technology, launching rocket bombs at a time when they could serve no purpose but the creation of a spirit of vengeance, illustrates how blind to total reality one may become through absorption in means. We have confined ourselves thus far to the kind of obsession which results from attention to peripheral matter and to specialization of labor. But there is another way in which science and its metaphysical handmaiden, progress, discourage sanity. This is the exaltation of, quote, becoming, end quote, over, quote, being, end quote. In effect, the domination of becoming produces another sort of fragmentation, which may be called, quote, presentism, end quote. Alan Tate has made the point that many modern people, to whom the word, quote, provincial, end quote, is anathema, are themselves provincials in time to an extreme degree. Indeed, modernism is in essence a provincialism, since it declines to look beyond the horizon of the moment, just as the countryman may view with suspicion whatever lies beyond his county. There is a strong reason to group this with the psychopathic phenomena, because it involves impairment of memory, which is known to be one of the commonest accompaniments of mental pathology. It is apparent, moreover, that those who are in rebellion against memory are the ones who wish to live without knowledge, and we can in fact tell from their conduct that they act more than others on instinct and sensation. A frank facing of the past is unpleasant to the tender-minded, teaching, as it does, sharp lessons of limitation and retribution. Yet the painful lessons we would like to forget are precisely the ones which should be kept for reference. Santayana has reminded us that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And not without reason did Plato declare that a philosopher must have good memory. An interesting commentary on presentism is that people close to the soil appear to have longer memories than the urban masses. Traditions there live for generations. What their grandfathers did is real to them. Consequently, they may be said to assimilate lessons. The provincial in time sees that interpretation of the past requires reflection and generalization, which take him beyond the moment. He clutches at the temporal fragment. More fundamentally, he is opposing timelessness, though the timeless cannot be permanently obscured or evaded. It keeps with us like a monitory shadow. The very possibility that there may exist timeless truths is a reproach to the life of laxness and indifference which modern egotism encourages. It is entirely likely, therefore, that concentration upon the moment is another outlet through obsession. In this way, ideas which have their reference to the periphery or the individuum, to the particular in space and time, are false and stand in the way of integration. To those who believe in transcendentals, progress is without relation to space and time. It is possible, therefore, to think of a metaphysical course towards center, which will be neither a going backward nor a going forward in the current sense of those phrases. After such thinking, we find ourselves looking upon the specialist as a man possessed of an evil spirit. Next, we might find ourselves admiring the internal aplomb of the gentleman, though this would be but another stage of the way. Then, as we begin to inquire what makes the gentleman, we should be soon looking in the direction of the philosophic doctor for a yet profounder integration of character, to Philistines and apostles of the Whig theory of history. This would be retrogression, and we will agree that it calls for sacrifice of many things they regard as indispensable. Like peace, regeneration carries a price, which those who think of it idly will balk at. But I propose to tell this part of the story in the last 3 chapters.